Is of talks. There's talks from the archaeology of the county to pivotal events of the decade of centenaries. And one of the talks is actually on this Saturday. It's Judith McCarthy, who's a curator at the museum, chatting about stories of casualties and survivors in the First World War. Her talk is called From Behind the Walls, and it's one of three talks, and we'll get to the other two in just a moment. But Judith is with me now in the studio. Good afternoon, Judith.
Good afternoon, John.
Thanks for coming in, and tell us a little bit more about, in general, what your talk is about.
Okay, well, as you know, we've done a huge amount of research in the museum in telling the stories of Donegal in the First World War. We've done exhibitions, we've run events, and we also published the 5th edition of the Donegal Book of Honour a few years ago. And in doing this research, we've uncovered stories not just of those who died during the war, but also those who survived, but who were also casualties. Particularly then I focused on doing some research into those who passed through the workhouse system and also those who ended up in what was then known as the Donegal District Lunatic Asylum.
Why such a focus on World War I? Is it that, you know, these stories need to have a light shone on them? Yes,
basically. So when we started our research, probably about 20 years ago now, the stories were not really known about. It was at a time when people were kind of still very hesitant about sharing stories of their loved ones from that period, because there was still that leftover of, you know, we don't really want to talk about the fact that people from our family were involved fighting for the British in the First World War. That has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. So those stories have come to light, but as is always the case, there's always more information on those that died, and that's understandable. And those who survived continued to live their lives, you know, suffering the consequences of what happened to them during the First World War.
Okay, so it's a case of those who died, it'll be military records about, especially once they went into service and how they died, and that'll be well documented. Those that survived could have gone into some sort of a system, and the record keeping just wouldn't have been.
And also, when a soldier died during the war, so they would have a lot of the time got a Commonwealth war grave, you know, so they're recognised that way. There's a memorial to them. Sometimes if their bodies weren't recovered, their name is on a memorial. And so it's easier to track them and to trace them. But those who survived, for many of them, they continue to live with the trauma after the war, and their records are a little bit harder to find unless you go looking for them.
Yeah, okay. And in the fullness of time now, we now understand the effects that shell shock and war and the horrors of war would have had on these young men.
Yes.
And they had to suffer the consequences. Give us a couple of examples.
Okay, well, in my talk, I'm going to be talking about some of those who died during the war and just stories about them, how we've connected them to each other, but also stories of some of those who survived. So, for instance, there were two brothers, Ezekiel and Andrew Smith, and they were from the convoy area. They were the sons of Thomas and Mary Smith. They both died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916. They were fighting with the Royal Inniskillen Fusiliers.
Young men.
Young men, very young. One was 23, the other was 25. So, but what I discovered in my research is that there was another soldier called Robert Sheldon, who was from Rafo, and he served with the South African Infantry, and he had actually been served in South Africa prior to the war. So he had been a kind of, you know, already a soldier prior to the First World War. And when I found him in the 1911 census, he was living in Rafo with his mother, Fanny. But one of the servants in the home was Ezekiel Smith at 18.
Oh, so you found that connection?
Yes. I think what happened, and I mean, I'm just using my imagination a little bit.
They were influenced.
Yes, absolutely. Of course they were. So there was this soldier who had previously served in South Africa, you know, probably sharing stories of what it was like. They didn't talk about the bad stuff. They never talked about how horrible it was. Just sharing stories of comradeship and, you know, we were fighting for a good cause and these young men were influenced. I've no doubt they were influenced by that, and then enlisted themselves, and all ended up dead at the end of the war.
And it probably wouldn't have been horror on the scale of the First World War.
Absolutely not.
Ended up being.
Exactly. So, the fighting, there was never anything prior to that on the scale of what happened in the First World War. There is absolutely no comparison. You did not have the trench warfare. You did not have the sort of equipment that they had and developed during the First World War. So these young men wouldn't have had any idea what to expect, and nor did Robert Sheldon himself. He didn't know what to expect when he enlisted again in the First World War.
Went off to fight.
Went off to fight, and they all ended up dying. So that's just one story. There's another young man, Joseph Brogan. I was looking in the records of the workhouses in Donegal. They're all online, actually. The original workhouse records, a lot of them are in the Donegal archives, but they are also online on Find My Past, which you can get free access through the library service.
Okay. So some of these men would have come back from war and rather than be able to rely on a decent pension, they ended up in the workhouse.
Well, in some cases, in the case of this particular gentleman, he actually was in the workhouse during the war. So he came home probably on furlough or on leave at the time. And we find him in the records of the Donegal Town Workhouse because he was from the Donegal area. So he entered the workhouse on the 25th of April 1916. And in the indoor admission records, he's listed as either aged or infirm. Now, he wasn't aged. He was a young man. So he had obviously been injured at some stage and was listed as being infirm. But he wasn't injured sufficiently that it put him out of the fighting. He was obviously injured. There's no record of what injury he received. Those records don't exist. But he obviously, as the listing says, aged and infirm.
Now, people that ended up in the workhouse, my understanding was that it was they couldn't afford to keep themselves and ended up there.
Sometimes,
but more than
that was certainly the case in the sort of early years of the workhouse in the late 19th century when the workhouses first opened. In the kind of early 20th century, we have to remember that there wasn't really a very good healthcare system in Ireland at the time, and the workhouses had infirmaries. So sometimes
filled those gaps.
Yes, people ended up in the workhouse because they were ill. You get people with fevers, with influenza, scarlet fever, and in this case of Joseph, and again, we have to use our imaginations a little bit here because the records can only tell you so much. That he passes through the workhouse between the 25th of April and the 8th of May 1916.
Yes.
And he's listed as being infirm. So probably had been injured, maybe not fully recovered, spent a little bit of time in the workhouse just to kind of get himself back on his feet again. But he's also in the County Donegal Book of Honour. So Joseph was part of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Inniskill and Fusiliers, and he died on the 16th of November 1916. So only a number of months after he left Donegal. As I said, he was probably here, maybe having been injured, resting up, back again.
Back to the front again.
And killed within a few months of him being in the workhouse.
And I noticed that one of the case studies is a private LP.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it a private LP? What's the full name?
Well, unfortunately, I can't tell you his full name because private LP, I found his records in the Donegal District Lunatic Asylum, and we wanted to keep them anonymous because the families are probably still living in Donegal, and these men deserve, although their stories deserve to be told, equally it's 100 years ago. It's only 100 years ago. Okay. And there is confidentiality issues around the records associated with the asylum. Again, they are in the care of the Donegal archives, and they have very specific access policy relating to how you can access the records.
It's called the Donegal District Lunatic Asylum. It would have been the closest equivalent to a psychiatric hospital.
Absolutely. Well, it eventually became St. Connell's Psychiatric Hospital. It's on the same. That's the site of it. So it started off life as Donegal District Lunatic Asylum, opened in around the 1850s, then became Cheer Connell Mental Hospital, and then became St. Connell's Psychiatric Hospital. Okay. So he was admitted into Donegal District Lunatic Asylum in around November of 1919 from Belfast War Hospital, which was also a place where soldiers went when they had psychiatric issues. He was described as having chronic mania and delusions, slight paralysis, the cause of which they said was the stress of campaign, stress of the war, and the duration was 2 years and 2 months. And he had been sent in under an Army Act of 1881. When I looked for him then in the records that exist, that you can find for the soldiers from the First World War, I found a record. It's known as the Silver War Badge. It was awarded to soldiers who were injured during the war. And what it says is that he enlisted in 1915, served overseas, and then was discharged in November of 1919, considered no longer physically fit for war service.
So your stories will be about those who served and died, and those who served and survived, and what became of them after that, and from Donegal.
Yeah, subsequently LP, as I said, he was admitted into Donegal District Lunatic Asylum in 1919, and he subsequently died there in 1941.
Oh, that's a long.
Yeah, so he was in the hospital, I would say, from 1919 to 1941.
All right, the talk is this Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock at the Donegal County Museum. And then the other talk, there's 2 other talks as well. One of them is next week, next Thursday, to mark International Museums Day.
Yes, that's right. And we have Jane O'Shaughnessy from the National Monument Service. She's an archaeologist, and she's going to come up and she's going to talk to us about recent discoveries, archaeological discoveries in Donegal.
Okay, so if you fancy a bit of
ancient history,
a bit of digging about, you never know what you might find, then Jane will open your eyes. And the final talk then is the Wednesday 24th, and that is with Dr. Niamh Brennan. Yeah,
that's Niamh. She's the county archivist, and she's going to talk about the Irish Grants Committee, which existed towards the end of the sort of War of Independence, Civil War period, and compensated people who had suffered either through incidences that happened either personally themselves or to their property. And so she's going to be telling some of the stories of people from Donegal who were compensated through the Irish Grants Committee.
Okay, well, great series of talks, and those details online, I presume.
Yes, they'll be on. You can find them either on our Facebook page or on our website.
Okay, Judith, thank you.
Thank you.